Ooh. The afternoon I finally said the thing out loud. Nora Devlin had honey on her wrists and a half-asleep bee walking the back of her glove, and I was leaning on a gate I'd been meaning to fix for the better part of 2 years. That's the part nobody believes when I tell it. They want it to have happened somewhere with a view, up on the ridge where you can see clear across the valley to the North Mountain, or down by the bay where the tide goes out a kilometer and comes back like it's in a hurry. But no, it happened by a sagging cedar gate between my land and the Devlins, with the smell of apple blossom so thick you could have spread it on toast. I should back up. My name's Theo Brennan. I'm 31, and I grow apples just outside Aylesford, in the Annapolis Valley, which is about as far from anything important as you can get in Nova Scotia and still have the road plowed in February. It's a small operation, 12 acres of trees, mostly Honeycrisp and Cortland, and a stubborn old block of Gravensteins my grandfather put in before anyone thought to ask whether they'd sell. There's a barn that leans a little more every year, a press in the back where I make cider in the fall, and a farmhouse that's been Brennan property since before the war. My father ran it before me. He died 4 years back in October, the worst possible month, with half the crop still on the trees. Heart. He was 63 and he'd been telling everyone he'd outlive the lot of them. After he was gone, the house went quiet in a way I didn't have words for. My mother passed when I was 19, so it had been the two of us a long while, him and me, mostly bickering about pruning and the price of diesel. I never realized how much noise one cranky old man made until there wasn't any. No radio going in the kitchen at 5 in the morning. No boots dropped by the door. No one telling me I'd loaded the wagon wrong. I'd come in from the orchard after dark, stand in the kitchen with the lights off, and just listen to the fridge hum. I told myself I liked the quiet. I'm a private sort. But there's a difference between quiet you choose and quiet that's just absence, and some nights I knew exactly which one I had. The Devlins are my neighbors to the east. Gordon and Pauline and their daughter Nora. Their land butts up against mine along Meadow Brook, a thin, fast little stream that floods every spring and takes out a section of fence so reliably you could set your watch by it. The Devlins keep a market garden and a roadside stand out on the highway, the kind with a coffee can for honest payment and a chalkboard that says what's ripe. Eggs, beans, sweet corn in August, jars of Pauline's chow chow and Gordon's terrible attempts at maple, and honey. That was Nora's part of it. She kept bees. I'd known her my whole life the way you know everybody around here, by family and by sight. She's 27, 4 years behind me, and folks in the valley think the world of her, not because she works at it. Some people are kind the way water runs downhill, just naturally, without making a thing of it. Nora would drop off eggs to old Mrs. Arsenault when her hip was bad and never mention it. She'd sit with somebody's kid at the rink so a tired mum could go warm up in the car. She ran the bee yard, helped her dad with the stand, did the books for both because she was better with numbers than either of her parents, and every spring she'd truck her hives out among my apple trees because the bees and the blossoms needed each other. And our fathers had shaken hands on that arrangement back when I was in short pants. So for years, Nora Devlin was just a fact of my life, the Devlin girl. A good, steady, well-liked young woman, the kind any fellow would count himself lucky to end up with someday. I'd have told you that flatly, the way you'd say the brook floods in spring. I just never once thought it had anything to do with me. That changed on a Tuesday in May, though I didn't know it was changing at the time. The spring runoff had taken out the fence along the brook again, 2 whole panels, posts and all, lying down in the mud like they were tired. I went out after lunch with the post pounder, a coil of wire, and a thermos of coffee gone lukewarm. It was one of those valley days that make the whole long winter feel like a fair trade. Sky scrubbed clean, the orchard in full blossom, pink and white as far as I could see, and the hum of the bees so steady it was almost a sound you could lean on. I was wrestling a new post into the bank when I saw her come down through my own trees, with her smoker and her gear. Nora moved through the orchard rows, checking the hives, lifting frames, doing the slow, careful work of it. She wasn't wearing the full suit, just the veil and gloves, the way she did when the bees were calm. I watched her tilt a frame up to the light to read it. I didn't know then that was what she was doing, reading the comb like a page, and set it back gentle as anything. She had a way of moving that didn't waste a thing. No fuss, no hurry. And I stood there in the mud, with a post half-driven, and found I'd stopped working entirely, just to watch a woman I'd known for 20 years, do a job I'd seen her do 100 times. Then she looked up and saw me. Theo. She pushed the veil back off her face, She had a smudge of something on her cheek and her hair was coming loose. Nora. I leaned on the pounder like I'd meant to all along. She nodded at the wreck of the fence. Brooke got it again. Linger. Every year. Dad keeps saying, you two ought to rip-rap that bank. She said it with the particular flatness of a person who's said it before and been ignored. Your dad's been saying that since I was 12. She almost smiled. We talked a few minutes. The blossom set. Whether the bees would have a good year, how the stand was slow because the tourists weren't down from the city yet. Ordinary backfence talk. Then she went back to her frames and I went back to my post, and that should have been the whole of it. It wasn't. I kept finding reasons to look up. The afternoon light caught in her hair the same as it caught in the blossoms, and I noticed, the way you notice a thing you've been carefully not noticing, that I didn't want her to leave when she packed up her smoker and went home through the trees. I didn't say a word to anybody. Wouldn't have known how. A couple of weeks on came the Apple Blossom Festival, which down here is the event of the year. It's been going since the 30s. A parade through Kentville and Berwick, a fiddle stage, kids' games, more pie than is reasonable, and most of the valley turning out in their good clothes to stand around in a field and talk about frost dates and whose barn needs paint. I almost didn't go. Festivals aren't my natural habitat, but I shaved, put on a clean shirt, and drove down, and the first people I saw were the Devlins set up under a tent, Pauline ringing through jars of honey and chow chow, and Gordon holding court about his maple to anyone who'd stand still. Nora wore a plain dress the color of the brook in summer, a soft kind of blue-green, and she'd done something with her hair so it stayed up. Nothing showy. She was helping a line of customers and laughing at something a little kid said, and I stood across the field with a paper cup of coffee from the Lions Club booth and could not for the life of me make my eyes go anywhere else. Inside of half an hour, I watched 3 different fellows find a reason to chat her up. One was a decent enough guy from over Canning Way, who I knew kept 100 acres of corn. He leaned on the Devlin's table for a good 10 minutes, and Nora was friendly to him the way she was friendly to everybody, and I stood there with my coffee going cold and a feeling in my chest I didn't care for one bit. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was just keeping an eye on a neighbor. I'm not the kind of man who lies to himself easily, though, and that one didn't take. Bernadette Arsenault found me by the pie table. She's 80 if she's a day, sharp as a tack, and she's known me since I was christened. She followed my line of sight without bothering to be subtle about it. She's a fine girl, that one, she said. Who? Mrs. Arsenault gave me a look that could have curdled milk. Don't you who me, Theo Brennan? I knew your father, and I know that face. You've been staring at the Devlin girl for 20 minutes like she owes you money. I have not been staring. She patted my arm once, the way you'd pat a slow dog you were fond of. Your father waited too long for everything, God rest him. Don't you make a hobby of it. And she moved off toward the squares before I could think of one thing to say back. I drove home under a sky full of the stars and stopped on the gravel halfway up my own lane, which is not a thing I do. I sat there with the engine off and made myself answer the question I'd been ducking. Why did it bother me, watching those fellows talk to Nora Devlin? Why was I still seeing that blue-green dress every time I shut my eyes? The answer came slow, but it came clear. I wanted to see her every day. Not as the Devlin girl, not as the neighbor with the bees. As the person who might make those dark, quiet rooms in my house feel like something other than empty. I sat there a long time, listening to the spring peepers down in the wet ground by the brook, and what I felt wasn't excitement exactly. It was more like finding a thing in your pocket you'd forgotten you owned. After that, I started paying attention in a way I hadn't let myself before. Small things. The way she lifted 2 fingers off the wheel when she drove past my place in the Devlin's old Ford. The fact that I found myself checking the brook fence a good deal more often than a fence needs checking, on the chance she might be out among the hives. June came in warm and wet, the way it does in the valley, and the bees worked the white clover in the headlands, and I worked up the nerve to do absolutely nothing about any of it. It was Hollis Crane who finally put a boot to me. Hollis is the oldest man on our road, a widower up past the Devlins, 86 and meaner than a wet cat about most things, but the whole valley would carry him on their backs if it came to it. His health had been going downhill, and that summer it tipped. Nora started bringing him supper a few times a week, soup, a loaf, sometimes just a jar of honey because his stomach was off and honey went down easy. One morning, I was up the ladder thinning apples when I saw her walking the road with a basket. and I came down without giving myself time to think it through, wiped my hands on my jeans, and called her name. Mind if I walk along? I asked. She looked surprised. You're busy. Keep. It'll keep. You don't have to. I know I don't. I held her eye. I want to. She studied me a second longer than was comfortable, then nodded, and we walked the gravel together in the morning sun. I've never been much for talk, but with Nora the quiet didn't itch. She told me about a swarm she'd caught off the Hendersons' maple, how she'd shaken 20,000 bees off a branch into a cardboard box, like they were nothing. She told me the price of jars had gone up again, and her dad was being stubborn about it. She didn't fill every silence. She talked when she had something to say, and let the rest of it be. And I found I was listening harder than I usually bothered to. At Hollis's place, she warmed the soup on his old propane stove, tidied his counter, looked in his woodbox, and asked had he taken his pills. He watched her do it with the expression of a man watching a granddaughter he was proud of and would never once admit it to. Then he looked over at me with no attempt at all to hide what he was thinking. When Nora stepped into the back room for a bowl, he said, low and plain, "You're a damn fool if you can't see what's standing in your own field." I went still. From the kitchen there was the small clatter of a spoon set down too hard. "I'm working on it," I said, keeping my voice down. Hollis snorted. "Work faster. Good women don't stand around waiting on a man to find his nerve. I waited 3 years to ask my Lily, and I count every one of them a waste." One. On the walk back, Nora and I didn't say a word about it, but the quiet between us had changed temperature. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something neither of us was ready to name, and we both knew it, and we walked the whole way home pretending we didn't. It was another Tuesday. I'd started to think of Tuesdays as days that meant something. When I found her down by the brook again, working the hives I'd let her keep at the edge of my orchard. The blossoms were long gone by then. The little apples had set and the trees were heavy and green. She had her veil pushed back and she was humming to herself, not loud, just under her breath, the way a person does when they think they're alone. I stood by that broken-down gate and watched her ease a frame up and tilt it to the light, and the smell of warm honey and beeswax and cut grass came across the fence at me, and I thought about everything Bernadette Arsenault had said, and everything Hollis had said, and that night on the lane when I'd finally told myself the truth. The words got out before I could stop them. "You know," I said, "the man who marries you is going to be a lucky fellow." I said it like a simple fact, like remarking on the weather. I figured she'd laugh, wave the smoker at me, tell me I was being soft, and we'd go back to ordinary. She didn't. She went still with the frame half raised, the bees crawling slow across the comb, and the color came up in her face. Not all at once, but steady, like a stove element warming. She set the frame back down careful and didn't look at me right off. When she finally did, the look on her face went straight through me. It was open and a little scared and completely made up about something, all at the same time. "I've been waiting for him to notice me," she said. Quiet, almost too quiet to catch over the water. I stood there on my side of the gate and couldn't find a single word. The brook kept running. A bee bumped the veil hanging loose at her shoulder. "Nora," I managed, and because I have never in my life been any good at coming at a thing sideways, I just said it. I meant it. "I know you did." She held my eye. That's why I said it back. "How long?" I asked. "Have you been how long?" She closed up the hive before she answered, snugged the lid down, gave it a pat. "Since the festival. Maybe before." She glanced at me, and there was the smallest flicker of mischief in it. I just hadn't said it to myself yet. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. So I was the slow one. "By a fair bit," she said, and the tightness between us let go all at once, and we both laughed, two people standing on either side of a broken gate by a brook, ridiculous and relieved. "Would you let me come round proper?" I asked. "I'd like to speak to your father." She picked up her empty basket. "Dad likes you." Then, because she couldn't help it, "He's been hoping you'd sort yourself out for about a year. He had money on it with Mum. I think he lost." She walked back up through my trees, and I stayed by that gate a long while after she'd gone. What I felt wasn't triumph. It was more like gratitude that I hadn't sailed right past her, that she'd been braver than me when it counted, that something this size had come out of one clumsy sentence said over a fence with bees in the air. I put on my one good shirt, scraped my boots, and drove the half-kilometer to the Devlins. I was more nervous than I'd been the time the cider press blew a hose and sprayed 100 liters across the barn. Gordon was already out on the porch in his chair, which told me Nora had warned him I was coming. He's a big, quiet man, gray in his beard, the kind who doesn't need to raise his voice to make you sit up. He nodded at the chair beside him. Sit down, Theo. I sat. We looked out at the garden going dark, the bean rows and the corn coming up. After a while I said the thing I'd come to say. I'd like your blessing to court Nora, properly. He was quiet a good long moment. I could hear my own pulse. Then he said, Why now? I turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the field. I'm asking straight, he said. Pauline and I have watched you circle that girl for nearly 2 summers. There were nights we thought about driving over and telling you to your face. Heat went up my neck. I was slow. Steady, he said, which was kinder than I deserved. That's the word we used. Steady. He turned and looked at me then, and his eyes were not unkind, but they were not letting me off either. Nora doesn't ask for much. She's spent her whole life looking after other people. The stand, the bees, your hives, Hollis Crane, half the road. She'll carry a great deal and never complain about the weight of it. That doesn't mean she doesn't need a man who sees it, who sees her. You understand the difference? I do, I said. I see her. She held my eye a long beat, then gave one short nod. Suppers at 6 most nights. Pauline always makes too much, and that was that. From then on, I was at the Devlins' table more often than my own. Ruth, no, Pauline, set an extra place without ceremony, just slid it in like it had always been there. The first week I came 4 times. Gordon asked about the orchard and the price of diesel. Pauline talked about the stand. Nora sat across from me and caught my eye over the lamp and smiled the small private smile that I was already coming to wait for, and now and then she'd drop a dry little comment that put the whole table laughing. That summer went by in pieces of time we stole from work, because that's the only kind of time people like us have. She'd come help me sort the disaster I called bookkeeping, because she could read a ledger and I could not. I'd drive her into Kentville for jars and lids, and lift the heavy cases so she didn't have to. I started bringing her wildflowers from the headlands. Not bought ones, just lupins and daisies and the wild roses off the fence rows, whatever was out. She never made a fuss over them. But I noticed a few days after that she'd pressed them flat between the pages of a heavy book on the porch, and a while later I saw she'd kept them. One slow afternoon she tried to teach me to extract honey, and I made an absolute hash of it, spun the frames too hard, cracked one, got honey to the elbows, and somehow into my hair. Nora looked at the mess of me for a second and said, Well, that's a start. When I asked was that her way of saying I'd ruined it, she said, It's my way of saying you'll be better at it next time. And I was. There's a thing I learned that summer that I think about still. We were down by the brook one evening, the light going long and gold over the water, and I asked her. I don't know why, it just came to me whether she was happy. Here in the valley, with the stand and the bees, and the same 40 kilometers of road she'd known her whole life. She thought about it a good while. Nora never said a thing just to make a person feel better. I think happy is mostly something you build, she said finally, not something you go and find. People who spend their lives looking for it, somewhere else generally walk right past the pile of it they were standing in. She looked over at me. What about you? I looked across the brook at my own dark house up the slope. I think I'm happier than I've been in a long time, I said, and it was the truest thing I'd said in years. That fall, while we were courting, I did a thing I didn't tell her about. The farmhouse had an old porch on the east side, half rotted, that my father had screened in once and then let go to ruin. Through October, after the harvest was in and the sideshare pressed, I worked on it in the evenings by trouble light. New decking, new posts, a proper screen so the black flies couldn't get at you in June. I built a little rail wide enough to set a mug on. And I cut the brush back from in front of it so that anyone sitting there with their morning coffee would look straight out across the orchard rows, toward the brook and the line of hives at the edge of the trees. I did it because of her. Because a woman who got up before light to work bees and run a market stand might like a place to sit in the early sun, where she could watch her own hives come awake, before the day started asking things of her. November, her mother came over with her to see about the house, to figure where things might go if it came to that. When Nora stepped out onto that east porch and saw the morning light pouring across the new boards and out over the trees, she stopped. You did this, she said, and didn't say a word. I did. Why, this side? I shrugged like it was nothing. Faces the hives. I figured you'd want to keep an eye on your bees with your coffee. She was quiet a long time. Then she crossed the porch and took my hand and held onto it tight, the way a person holds something they mean to keep. "Thank you," she said. Just that. And I understood she wasn't thanking me for a porch. She was thanking me for thinking of her through the whole autumn, before she'd ever lived a day in that house, for making her a place in a home that had been only mine and my father's and, for a long time, no one's. I figured out, standing there, that love doesn't always need a speech. Sometimes it's just a man quietly building a porch on the east side and waiting for the person he loves to walk out into the light. I asked her to marry me in December, by the brook, at that same broken gate I had finally that fall gotten around to fixing. I'd thought about doing it somewhere with a view, up on the North Mountain, where you can see the whole valley laid out and the bay beyond it. But the more I turned it over, the more I knew that wasn't us. We didn't start up a mountain. We started right there, between a fence and a beehive, over one honest, clumsy sentence. I'd been carrying my mother's ring in my coat pocket for 3 weeks, a plain, thin band with a small stone, nothing you'd remark on, but it was what she'd left. The afternoon I picked was cold and bright, a skiff of early snow on the ground, and the brook running black between white banks. Nora had a scarf wound up to her chin. I took the ring out, and all the smooth words I'd practiced went straight out of my head, so I just told her the truth in the plainest way I had. I told her I knew I'd been slow. I knew it had taken me far longer than it should have to see what had been standing in my own field the whole time. But I saw her now. I saw her clear every single day. How she looked after people, how she did the quiet work nobody clapped for, how she could make a market stand and a row of beehives and a plain Tuesday feel like they added up to something. I told her I wanted to keep seeing her every day for the rest of my life, and would she marry me? She looked at me for what felt like a long time, snow coming down soft between us. Then her whole face went, that real smile she couldn't have hidden if she'd tried. "Theo Brennan," she said, "you certainly took your sweet time." Is that a yes? Of course, it's a yes. All. I put my mother's ring on her finger right there by the gate, under the bare cottonwoods with the snow coming down, and when she looked at it, I knew she wasn't looking at the stone. She was looking at the life it stood for. Then she lifted her face, and I kissed her for the first time, and the brook kept on running the way it always had, and the snow kept falling. But for me, the whole world had quietly changed its mind about what it was going to be. When we told her folks, Pauline cried, the good kind of crying, the kind a mother does when she's been watching a thing come together for years. Gordon shook my hand and didn't say much, but that handshake carried more than most men's speeches. The next morning I stopped at the co-op for fencing staples, and Dwayne behind the counter looked at me a second and said only, "About time." I heard some version of that all week. From Hollis Crane, from Bernadette Arsenault, who said, "I told you not to make a hobby of it," and looked entirely too pleased with herself. I started to understand that the thing between Nora and me had been plain to the whole valley a long while before I was willing to say it out loud myself. We married in May, the next spring, the Saturday of Blossom Week. After a hard rain Friday, the sky came up clean, and the whole valley was in bloom, pink and white from the mountain down, the air thick and sweet with it. Half the road came. It wasn't a fancy do, no hall in the city, no band you'd have heard of. We had it on the grass behind the Devlin's place, wooden chairs in rows, jars of Nora's honey on every table, wildflowers out of the fence rows, and enough food to feed 3 counties, because every neighbor brought a dish. Reverend Coates kept it short, the way he's best. Old Leo played fiddle after, and people ate and danced on the grass until the light went out of the sky. Hollis Crane sat in the front row, grumbling. The music was too loud, and I caught him wiping his eyes twice and pretended I hadn't. When it was nearly over, Mrs. Arsenault walked past me and said 2 words. "Told you," and this time I didn't argue. Night. Nora came home to my house. Our house, now. The new porch on the east side, the orchard out front, the hives at the edge of the trees gone quiet for the night. She sat at the kitchen table with her hair down after the long day, both hands round a mug of tea, and looked around the room like she was settling into it, and then she looked at me. "We're going to be happy here," she said. "You know that, don't you?" "Dude, I know it." "When did you know? About me?" I smiled. "Bit later than you did, I expect." "But you got here," she said. I reached across the table and took her hand. I got here. The years after weren't a storybook. Some springs the brook took out more than a fence. Some falls the price of apples didn't cover the cost of picking them, and we ran lean, and I lay awake doing arithmetic in the dark. But the life we built was made of ordinary days and the plain stubborn choice to keep picking each other out of all the other things a person could pick. Nora took over the books because we both knew she ought to. Or, Her honey did well at the Wolfville market, well enough that we put in more hives, and people drove out from town just to buy it off the stand at the end of our lane. She started a little group of women up and down the road who shared seed and tools and put up extra preserves for whoever was having a hard winter. She never thought it was anything. People still talk about it. Our boy came in the spring of the third year. We named him Gordon, after her dad, and call him Gordy, and he came into the world hollering and never properly stopped. Nora says he's like me. I say he's like her. He's probably both. 2 years on, we had a girl, and I named her Eleanor after my mother, and she's got Nora's steady hands and my bullheadedness, which Nora calls a dangerous combination, and I call about right. One Tuesday this past fall, I was down at the brook fixing the fence again after high water, the same as I always do, when Nora came down through the orchard with both kids and a basket. Not laundry, never that, but the kids' jackets and a thermos and a jar of honey for Hollis, who's still hanging on up the road, ornery as ever. Gordy ran out ahead, yelling for me to put him up on my shoulders. Eleanor came behind, with a face like a small judge, sure the whole world ought to wait while she caught up. Nora lifted 2 fingers off the basket and waved, exactly the way she had that first Tuesday by the gate a lifetime ago. I climbed over the fence, swung Eleanor up onto my hip and let Gordy scramble onto my shoulders, and they started straight in arguing about who had the better spot while Nora laughed. The apple trees were heavy and red, the brook ran on. Out at the edge of the orchard, the hives murmured, putting up the last of the year's honey. Nora leaned her head against my arm. "You still remember?" she said. "Right here, you told me whoever married me would be a lucky man." I remember. She looked at the 2 kids, then back up the slope toward our house, the porch on the east side catching the afternoon sun. "You were right," she said. I looked at her. "I'm the lucky one." She shook her head, practical as she's ever been. "We both are." I pulled her in closer, the boy laughing on my shoulders and the girl tugging my collar and the bees working the last warm light of the day. "Yeah," I said, "both of us." And standing there among my wife and my 2 loud children and the old fence and the old brook and the hum of those hives, I understood, clear as I've ever understood anything, what I had so nearly walked right past. Not because Nora Devlin was far away. Because she'd been right beside me the whole time. In the honey on the stand, in the soup carried up to Hollis Crane, in a blue-green dress across a festival field, in the lights of her house coming on across the pasture at dusk. I used to think the things that mattered most had to be found somewhere off down the road. Turned out the biggest thing in my life had been here all along. Doing quiet, ordinary work, waiting on me to be brave enough to look up from the fence and see it. The thing I keep circling back to is how close I came to losing all of it by doing nothing at all. Not through some great mistake, just through waiting. My father waited too long for nearly everything, and after he was gone, I caught myself doing the same, treating caution like it was the same thing as good sense. It isn't. The real kind of good sense, the kind I learned slow, and the hard way, is knowing the difference between a risk worth ducking and a life worth reaching for, and being honest enough with yourself to tell them apart. I dodged that fence by the brook for 2 summers. I could have dodged it forever and called myself careful right up until the day Nora Devlin married somebody else. What saved me wasn't luck, whatever the title says. When I finally said the plain thing by that gate, Nora answered the same day, and it took me a while to understand why she could. It was because the ground was already there under us. For years I'd fixed Gordon's fences without being asked, walked Nora up the road to Hollis Crane's with the soup, kept my word and paid what I owed and showed up when a neighbor needed a hand. None of that was a plan. I didn't do it to win anything, but decency isn't a trick you pull at the end. It's the floor you've been laying down the whole time, one ordinary act at a time, so that when the moment comes you're standing on something solid instead of thin air. Hollis told me good women don't wait around forever, and he was right. But the deeper truth was that Nora had been able to wait at all, only because she'd watched the kind of man I was when nobody was keeping score. And the courage I needed in the end wasn't one big leap. That's the part the young fellows never believe. It was the small, steady stuff, building that porch board by board in the dark in October, finally fixing the gate after 2 years of meaning to, driving over to face Gordon with my hat in my hands. Steadiness, Gordon called it, and he meant it kinder than I deserved. I've come to think that's the quietest strength there is. Not the nerve to do a brave thing once, but the will to keep turning up, season after season, choosing the same person and the same life on the cold mornings when nothing feels romantic at all. So if there's anything I'd hand a younger man, it's this. Be the sort of person people can trust before there's a reason to. Learn to see what's standing right in front of you instead of looking off down the road. And once you do see it, don't mistake stalling for wisdom. Find your nerve and keep finding it, every single day. The biggest thing in my life had been there the whole time, working bees at the edge of my own orchard, waiting on me to be brave enough to look up.